Margaret Elizabeth Cousins, popular as Greta in her distinctive circles of interest, should be remembered for her impressive achievements in India. Margaret Cousins lived in Ireland from 1878 to 1913, 1913 to 1915 in Britain, and in India from then until her death in 1954. Margaret Cousins was born as Margaret Elizabeth Gillespie on the 7th of November 1878 in Boyle, County Roscommon in the west of Ireland. Her family were the members of the Protestant Church of Ireland, whose ancestors had migrated from Scotland towards the close of the previous century. The eldest of 12 children, Margaret earned a scholarship to the Victoria High School for Girls in Derry and matriculated with distinction in 1898. She studied at the Royal Academy of Music in Dublin, graduating with a B Music in 1902. She married James Cousin in 1903, who was a poet, playwright, teacher, lecturer, and a government advisor. Margaret Cousins embraced several aspects of Brahminical Hindu culture in Dublin before she ever got involved in feminism or indeed in the Theosophical Society, such as the adoption with her husband of an ecologically and spiritually principled vegetarianism and a belief in reincarnation while quietly following Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. Margaret Cousins arrived in Adayar in November 1915 with her husband, Mr. James, on the invitation of Dr. Annie Besant, President of the Theosophical Society. Dr. James worked as a literary editor for the New India magazine published by Dr. Annie Besant from Adayar. She was elected to be the first non-Indian member of the Indian Women's University at Pune in 1916, and she worked very hard to improve the curriculum. In India, Cousins initiated a successful suffrage campaign and founded the first two nationwide women's movements, the Women's Indian Association WIA in 1917 and the All India Women's Conference AIWC in 1927 as umbrella organizations for all of the local Indian women's groups. While the WIA was based in South India and focused on the first wave of the suffrage issue, the far more broadly spread AIWC fronted a massive range of multi-leveled issues, although its original purpose was educational curricular reform. Always concerned with the interests of women and their welfare, Margaret Cousins involved herself in the already established Abala Abhivardhani Samaj, the Weaker Sex Improvement Society at Madanapalli. This model was used to form the Women's Indian Association in Madras. Margaret Cousins co-founded the Women's Indian Association along with Mrs. Dorothy Jinaraja Dasa. With clearly national aspirations, it began with 70 members. The WIA made efficient use of its social capital within the Theosophical Society to form branches first around South India and then towards the north. By 1922, the WIA had 43 branches and 2,300 members, and by 1927, it had 80 branches and 4,000 members. The aims of the Women's Indian Association engaged both the liberal individualistic ethic of sexual equality for its own sake with the idea of women's service to the future nation, to present to women their responsibilities as daughters of India, to secure for every boy and girl the right of education, including religious instruction, to secure the abolition of child marriage and other social evils, to secure for women the vote for municipal and legislative councils on the same terms as it is or may be granted to men, to secure adequate representation of women in municipalities, taluks, and local boards, legislative councils, and assemblies, to establish equality of rights and opportunities between men and women, to help women to realize that the future of India lies largely in their hands, or as wives and mothers, they have the task of training, guiding, and forming the character of the future rulers of India, and to bind women into groups for the purpose of self development and education and for the definite service of others. Though Margaret Cousins was known mostly as a musician, she was also a political activist, fighter for women's rights, and a champion of social equality. When the Montague-Chelmsford Commission was in preparation for drawing up possible political reforms, a women's deputation, 14 members from the Women's Indian Association, presented their petition composed by Mrs. Margaret, and it was read out to the Secretary of State and the Viceroy by Mrs. Sarojini Naidu. The suffrage victory kick-started Margaret Cousins' propaganda mission as she made the most of the suffrage success to raise the Indian woman high on those international graphs of liberation and progress, while also domestically using the political success to rally support for other non-suffrage reforms. She never missed an opportunity to connect advances in national reforms to more general planetary spiritual trends. Throughout 1917, the Women's Indian Association intensely lobbied and established relations with the major political groups in India on the question of women's voting rights, which soon bore fruits. When Southborough Commission visited India in 1918 to review the question of franchise, 45 branches of Women's Indian Association, in cooperation with the women's organizations, demanded equal voting rights for women, and these branches of the Women's Indian Association and other women's organizations passed resolutions and sent them to the committee. Through the persistence of Margaret Cousins and her supporters, Madras became the first Indian region to grant women full suffrage rights. Margaret Cousins had asked the government to provide for women teacher training colleges, homes for widows, medical colleges for women, and institutes for short-term maternity courses. Margaret Cousins was deeply concerned about the custom of child marriage and the lack of education and freedom among the girls. In 1921, there were over 10 million girls who had been married between the age of 10 and 15. According to her, religion, education, patriotism, and love were the four liberators of women. Women's suffrage was only one of Margaret Cousins' feminist concerns. In her books, numerous journals, and newspaper articles, she focused her attention on child marriage, the Parda system, the plight of young widows, the scarcity of education, and vocational training for women. Margaret Cousins brought out a magazine named Stri Dharma in English, Tamil, and Telugu in 1918 as a broadcasting medium for news about the women's movements in India and other countries, as it had exchanges with almost all important feminist papers in English and French. It was crucial to her that Indian women should keep abreast of women's progress abroad and vice versa. In 1919, she traveled 1,000 miles to become the first head of a girls' school at Mangalore. It was here that she came up against the reality of child marriage. Dr. James Cousins was fired for singing rather too strongly the praises of the executed leaders of the Easter Rebellion of 1916 in the pages of New India. Though James Cousins was offered a lectureship in English at a Christian missionary college in North India, he opted to stay within the Theosophical network by taking up a teaching position in the newly established Besant Theosophical College in Madanapalli, an inland hill town more than 200 miles west of Madras. Margaret Cousins was duly appointed teacher of English, domestic science, and handicrafts in the affiliated high school from which the college had developed. The Cousins were stationed in Madanapalli for the most part between 1916 and 1922. An important historical event took place in the premises of the Besant Theosophical College. Our national anthem, Jana Gana Mana, would have remained just a set of verses, but for the tune set to it by the Irish woman Margaret Cousins to be sung the way it is rendered today. Though the poem was written as early as 1911 by Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore and was first sung in a different tune at the annual session of the Indian National Congress at Calcutta on 27th December the same year, it was only in February 1919 that a refreshingly new tune was set to the composition by Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore visited Madanapalli and he sang the song to the audience gathered over there in a poetry reciting class conducted by Dr. James. Margaret Cousins rendered the song to the new tune she had composed in the presence of Tagore, and he offered his appreciation to the melody of the new tune. Mr. Nehru, the then Prime Minister, made some minor modifications to this tune and adopted it as a national anthem for the newly independent country. Margaret Cousins moved back to Adayar in April 1921 to help Dorothy Jinaraja Dasa organize women candidates for the general election to the legislature. Margaret Cousins declined the suggestion that she should be the first woman member to go forward for election to the Madras Legislative Council on the grounds that such a distinction belonged rightly to an Indian woman. Her lifelong friend Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy became the first Indian woman to sit in an Indian legislature in 1926 and was also elected Deputy President of the Legislative Council. In 1922, 7 years after her arrival in India, Margaret Cousins published the first of her 4 books, The Awakening of Asian Womanhood. Her first book is noticeable for the lengths to which she goes to point up the great diversity of Asian and Indian women as she found them differing according to class or caste and regional culture. With her community services widely recognized, she was appointed the first woman magistrate for the Saidapet Bar in Madras in 1923. This was the first time any woman had ever been invited to be a magistrate. She was in a position as a magistrate to observe the general injustices in society and have a role in correcting the behaviors of the individuals. Throughout the 1920s, Margaret Cousins was involved in setting up and sustaining various women's homes of service and the Avai home in Adayar. The function of the Women's Home of Service was to give vocational training to women and worked for child welfare and was the germ for the still thriving Madras Seva Sadan Women's Home. It was chiefly through the efforts of the Women's Indian Association that compulsory education for girls in Madras on the same terms as boys was introduced. The Madras Children's Act was enforced, the Children's Aid Society came into existence, and Indian women were induced to visit jails and hospitals. Mrs. Vijayalakshmi Pandit rightly observed, Mrs. Margaret Cousin's spirit could well inspire the people to greater efforts not only in the cause of women but in the cause of India which she loved. Though a foreigner, her contribution to India's freedom is indeed very great. The Indian people in general and women in particular owe a profound debt of gratitude to Mrs. Margaret Cousins. The two highly significant associations, the Women's Indian Association and the All India Women's Conference, were launched by Margaret Cousins and Dr. Annie Besant with the support of other Indian women. These associations continue to offer extraordinary service to the women in modern day India.